In the dust of an Athenian gymnasium, sometime in the years just before the close of the 5th century, before the Common Era, a broad-shouldered boy was given a name that was not his own. His birth name was Aristocles. His father had given him that name in the way Athenian fathers gave names, with an eye toward lineage, toward the family's long thread back through the city's aristocratic past, back through political offices and ancestral halls and the shadow of Solon himself, the great lawgiver, the man who had once held Athens in his hands and tried to shape it towards something just. But wrestling coaches do not think about lineage. They think about shoulders. And the boy had shoulders wide enough that the coach called him Plato, the broad one, and the name settled over him the way such names do, quietly and permanently, until the birth name was the forgotten one, and the nickname was what the centuries would carry. The gymnasium was a place of sanctioned noise. Boys argued and grunted and called out to one another across the sand. The sounds of a city at work drifted in from the streets beyond the colonnade, the clatter of the agora, the voices of merchants and citizens conducting the busy ordinary business of Athenian life. None of this, on a particular afternoon in the boyhood of a particular wide-shouldered student, had any apparent significance. The boy who would become Plato was not yet thinking about the nature of knowledge. He was thinking about the proper position of his feet, the angle of a grip, the way weight shifts before a throw. He had been educated in poetry and music, as the sons of Athenian aristocrats were educated, and he had some facility with words and with the formal structures that good rhetoric required. His family had designs on his future in the way that families with lineage and connections tend to have designs. Political life was the expected destination. Public office was the shape the future was meant to take, and the city was the arena in which a man of his background was expected to perform. Athens in those years had the quality of a city that has been through something and has not fully admitted it. The Peloponnesian War, the long grinding conflict with Sparta, had not yet reached its end, but its damage had already settled into the city's bones in ways that would take decades to fully understand. The confidence of the earlier century, the confidence of the Parthenon, of Pericles, of an empire that had genuinely believed itself to be the expression of something excellent in human nature, had begun to develop fractures that no amount of civic ceremony could fully paper over. Athens was still a democracy. It still convened in the assembly, still voted, still conducted the intricate machinery of popular governance that its citizens took as a sign of their collective wisdom. And beneath that machinery, visible to anyone who spent enough time in the agora listening carefully, was a restlessness that expressed itself in argument, in the performance of certainty, in the way that confidence and actual knowledge had become difficult to tell apart. A young man growing up in this city, educated in rhetoric, destined by birth and expectation for a political life, would have understood argument as a tool. Persuasion was the medium of Athenian public life. The sophists, traveling teachers who charged money to instruct in rhetoric and debate, had made the observation that any position could be argued convincingly, and had offered to teach this skill as a practical service to anyone who could afford their fees. This was not, in the sophists' own estimation, a troubling observation. It was an accurate one. They were pragmatists in a city that rewarded practical effectiveness. The ability to win arguments was genuinely useful, and they were genuinely able to teach it. Whether the position being argued was true seemed to them somewhat beside the point. Truth was contested. Opinion was what you could demonstrate. And demonstration, conducted skillfully before the right audience, was indistinguishable from proof. Somewhere in the years of his youth, Plato encountered Socrates. The exact circumstances are lost. What is not lost is the effect, which was eventually total. Socrates was already an unusual figure in Athens, an older man, famously ugly by his own cheerful admission, who had refused to charge fees for his conversations because he refused to claim that he knew anything worth charging for. He spent his days in the agora and the gymnasia and the houses of friends asking questions, not questions designed to display his learning, not questions with predetermined answers tucked behind them. Genuine questions asked with what appeared to be genuine uncertainty, which had the peculiar effect of revealing that the person being questioned did not know what they had been confidently assuming they knew. This made Socrates, in the long run, more enemies than friends. People who are comfortable with their opinions do not always welcome the examination that makes their opinions visible for what they are. But for a wide-shouldered young man with a gift for language and a family expectation pulling him toward politics, Socrates must have represented something that had no equivalent elsewhere in the city. Here was a man who cared more about whether an idea was true than about whether it could be made persuasive. Here was a form of conversation that was not a competition in the ordinary sense, not a performance for an audience, not a demonstration of rhetorical technique, but something more interior, more patient, more genuinely curious about the shape of the world behind the appearances. What Socrates practiced, Plato would later try to name and to describe and to defend for the rest of his life. What it was in that first encounter was simply the experience of being genuinely asked a question by someone who intended to stay there with you until something honest emerged. The city continued its restless business around this pair of figures, the old questioning man and the young man of noble lineage who had found something in the questions that would eventually cost him his political future and give him his philosophical one. The Peloponnesian War ended in 404 BCE, and its ending was not the kind that leaves a city intact. Sparta imposed the oligarchic government that became known as the 30 Tyrants, a brief, brutal seizure of power by men who used the moment to settle scores, confiscate property, and eliminate opposition with a directness that democratic procedure had previously prevented. 2 of the 30 were known to Plato personally. One was a relative. The period lasted only a year before a democratic restoration pushed the oligarchs out, but a year of that particular kind of governance leaves marks that do not simply fade when the government changes. Plato watched it. He was in his 20s. He had thought in the years before that he might find his way into political life under conditions that allowed for something principled. The 30 tyrants were not those conditions. The democratic restoration that followed the oligarchs was in some ways worse, not in its immediate conduct, but in what it eventually did. Democracy returned, the assembly reconvened, citizens voted, and in 399 BCE, on charges of impiety and corrupting the youth of Athens, a jury of 500 Athenian citizens voted to execute Socrates. Plato was not in the room when the verdict came down. The Phaedo records that he was absent from the final day on grounds of illness, and there is no reason to disbelieve this, though the absence must have had its own particular quality. The knowledge of what was happening in a room he was not in, the day shaped around a loss that was not yet complete. What settled in him afterward was not a feeling that can be captured simply. It was not grief alone, though grief was certainly present. It was something colder and more structural, the recognition that what had happened was not a mistake or a miscarriage in an otherwise sound system. The system had worked exactly as it was designed to work. 500 citizens had deliberated, and they had voted, and their verdict had been based not on knowledge of what Socrates had actually done, but on opinion about what he seemed to represent, on impressions formed by rhetoric and rumor and the accumulated irritation of people who had been made to feel ignorant by a man who kept asking them to justify what they claimed to know. The city that prided itself on wisdom had put its wisest citizen to death for asking questions. And what this revealed to the young man who had loved him was not that Athens had failed on this occasion, it was that Athens, in the condition it was in, could not have done otherwise. Opinion had been mistaken for knowledge for so long and at so many levels of civic life that a man who insisted on the distinction between them had become genuinely threatening to the people who governed by the former. The execution was not an accident, it was a consequence. And consequences, Plato had begun to understand, follow from structures. If the structure was wrong, the consequences would be wrong, and changing the individual actors would not change the outcome as long as the structure remained in place. This was the wound that never fully closed, and it was also the question that would shape everything that followed, not how to avenge Socrates, or how to restore his reputation, or how to argue that the jury had been wrong by its own standards. Those were the questions of a man who still believed the system was fundamentally sound and only needed correction at the margins. The question Plato was beginning to ask was a different order of question entirely. It was the question of what would need to be true about the way human beings relate to truth. What would need to be differently understood about the difference between knowing and merely believing, for something like this to become impossible rather than merely unfortunate. He did not stay in Athens. After the death of Socrates, he traveled to Megara and then further south and west into territories that offered contact with ways of thinking that had developed outside the Athenian orbit. In southern Italy, in communities shaped by the legacy of Pythagoras, he found something that quieted a particular kind of restlessness. The Pythagoreans believed that numbers were not tools of calculation, but the actual structural bones of reality, that what made a thing what it was had to do with proportion, ratio, the mathematical relationships that held its parts together. They combined this mathematical seriousness with a form of communal life that took the soul and its condition as matters of practical concern, not merely of theoretical interest. The rigor and the spiritual attention were not for them intention. They were the same thing, approached from different angles. Something in this combination began quietly reorganizing the way Plato thought about the problem he had been carrying since the death of Socrates. Mathematics, he had begun to notice, had a peculiar property that physical things lacked. A triangle drawn in sand could be imperfect, its angles slightly off, its sides slightly unequal, but the triangle that the geometer was reasoning about was not imperfect. The geometer was not reasoning about the sand drawing. The geometer was reasoning about triangularity itself, which no sand drawing had ever fully captured, and which no deterioration of the sand drawing could damage. The triangle in the sand would be scuffed away by the next foot that passed. Triangularity would not. It was there before the drawing and would be there after. And the knowledge of it, the genuine understanding of its properties, arrived at through reasoning rather than observation, was more stable, more reliable, and in some sense more real than anything the eyes had ever told anyone about any particular drawn shape. This was the beginning of something, though Plato did not yet have the full shape of it. What he had was an instinct that the confusion between opinion and knowledge, between the shifting and the stable, between the apparent and the real, was not a confusion that could be corrected simply by being more careful about which particular things one trusted. The confusion went deeper than that. It was a confusion about the kinds of things there were in the world, about what was even available to be known, and what only ever available to be opined about. and the solution, if there was one, would need to go to the same depth. He traveled to Syracuse in Sicily, and this was a different kind of lesson entirely. Syracuse was governed by Dionysius I, a tyrant of formidable practical intelligence and considerable cultural pretension, who had gathered around him the kind of court that powerful men with literary ambitions tend to gather: poets, intellectuals, people whose company was flattering to a ruler who wished to be seen as more than merely powerful. Plato went, in part through the connection of his friend Dion, who was both a genuine philosophical enthusiast and a member of the Syracusan court by family ties. The hope, and it was a hope that says something about the particular quality of philosophical optimism that Plato had developed in those years following the death of Socrates, was that a man of political power might also be a man capable of genuine philosophical development, and that the conjunction of political authority with philosophical understanding might produce something the city of Athens, with its 500 voting citizens and its preference for the rhetorically persuasive, had demonstrably failed to produce. The visit did not go well. Dionysius the first was not a man whose power made him curious about its foundations or its limits. Yet the precise manner of the failure, whether Plato was sold into slavery by an irritated tyrant or merely made unwelcome and encouraged to leave, is a matter on which the ancient sources are imprecise enough to allow some uncertainty. What is clear is that Plato returned to Athens not with the philosopher king in hand, but with a cleaner understanding of the distance between the ideal and the actual, between the person one imagined a powerful man might become and the person that power, untempered by philosophical habit, tends to make. He would return to Syracuse twice more in the following decades, drawn back by the hope that Dion represented, and by the new ruler Dionysius too, who was younger and seemed initially more tractable, and each return would confirm, at slightly greater cost, the same lesson. The idea of the philosopher king and the reality of men who held power were separated by more than good intentions could bridge. But something in the difficulty of the Syracusan visits clarified rather than dispirited him, in the way that certain kinds of failure clarify the nature of the problem they represent without diminishing the importance of solving it. The problem of how power and knowledge were to be brought into relation was not a problem that would be solved through the corridor of a Sicilian court. It was a problem that required something more patient, more institutional, more generational in its ambition. What had killed Socrates was not merely one bad jury. It was an entire culture of unreflective opinion wearing the robes of knowledge. Correcting that was not a project for one man in one court. It was a project for a school. Around 387 BCE, the dating is approximate, as most datings in the ancient world are, offered with the confidence of estimates made across 2.5 millennia. Plato founded the academy. The location was a grove on the outskirts of Athens, in a place sacred to the memory of the hero Academus. There was something appropriate about a grove, the old Greek sense that certain spaces had a quality that made particular kinds of activity fitting to them, that the intellectual life required not merely a building, but an environment whose character supported the work. The trees and the open air and the sense of being slightly outside the city's proper boundaries, slightly removed from the agora and the assembly and the daily performance of civic life. These were not incidental features. They were part of what the academy was trying to be. What it was trying to be was something that had not existed before in quite this form. Not a sophistic school, not a place where students paid to be taught the techniques of persuasion, not a political faction or a religious community, or simply a circle of friends, though it partook of elements of all of these. What Plato was founding was an institution dedicated to the serious, sustained, collaborative pursuit of knowledge, not of any particular body of knowledge, but of the conditions under which genuine knowledge, as distinguished from mere opinion, was possible at all. Mathematics was at the curriculum's center, and the tradition that runs through the centuries preserves the story, possibly apocryphal, certainly apt, that above the entrance to the academy were carved the words, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." Whether the words were literally there or not, the attitude they expressed was real. Geometry was not taught because geometers made good citizens, or because mathematical skill was useful in commerce. Geometry was taught because the practice of reasoning about things that could not be seen, from premises toward necessary conclusions, was the closest preparation available for the kind of thinking that Plato believed the mind needed to learn. The students who began to arrive in those first years were a varied collection. Some came from Athenian families, some came from further away, drawn by what was becoming a reputation for an unusual kind of intellectual seriousness. The conversations that took place in the academy were not lectures in the ordinary sense. Plato himself seems to have been suspicious of the lecture as a form, on the grounds that genuine philosophical understanding was not the kind of thing that could be transmitted by one person standing before another and stating propositions. It required the friction of genuine dialogue, the back and forth of question and answer, the experience of having one's assumptions examined from multiple angles until the ones that held were distinguishable from the ones that merely sounded convincing. This was Socrates' method, carried forward, and the academy was, among other things, an institutional answer to the question of what to do about Socrates' death. Not a monument to him, not a shrine, but a continuation of the practice that had made him both necessary and vulnerable. The city of Athens had demonstrated, with the finality of a hemlock cup, that it could not be trusted to protect the kind of inquiry Socrates represented. So Plato had built a place outside the city's normal jurisdiction, in a grove at its edges, where that inquiry could continue under conditions that a founding institution provided, not immortality, but durability. Not safety from all political interference, but enough of a structure to survive the individual death. Athens spread out beyond the grove in the particular quality of light that the Attic plain has in the hours when the day has not yet decided what kind of day it will be, that early softness before the heat commits. The students who arrived brought their questions with them, questions about justice and beauty and the good life and the structure of the physical world and the nature of the soul and the proper organization of the city. They were the questions that Athenian culture had been asking out loud for a generation, but asking them in the mode of the agora, loudly, rhetorically, competitively, with more investment in winning the argument than in following it wherever it genuinely led. In the academy, the mode was different, or Plato intended it to be different, and the intention was itself a philosophical position. The belief that the mode of inquiry mattered, that how one pursued a question shaped what kind of answer one was capable of receiving, was not separable from the content of what was being inquired about. If the good was genuinely knowable, and not merely the object of competing opinions, then the inquiry toward it required a different quality of attention than the agora could provide. It required patience and the willingness to follow an argument into discomfort without rushing to resolve the discomfort by declaring a winner. It required, above all, the practiced distinction between the satisfaction of having persuaded someone and the satisfaction of having found something true. These were not natural habits, they were acquired ones, and the acquisition required time and a place set aside for the purpose, and teachers who modeled the habits through their own practice rather than merely describing them. What Plato was doing in the Grove of Academus was building the conditions under which genuine philosophical inquiry became not merely possible, but habitual, built into the daily rhythm of a life, repeated until it became the default mode of the mind rather than an occasional achievement. Socrates had been the philosopher who had no school, no institution, no property beyond his own practice of questioning. He had walked through the city asking questions and had trusted the city to accommodate him, and the city had eventually decided it could not. Plato had seen what that trust cost. The academy was not a retreat from the city's problems. It was not a community of thinkers who had decided that politics was beyond remedy and that the only reasonable response was withdrawal. It was, in Plato's conception, more ambitious than that. It was a place that would produce, over generations, people capable of thinking clearly enough about justice and governance and the nature of the good to participate in public life from a different foundation than mere opinion. Whether this ambition was achievable was a question the Academy's decades of existence would test in various ways, with various results. But on the morning when the first students arrived, in the gentle light of the grove, with the city audible in the distance, and the question still fresh enough to carry some of the energy that freshness gives before familiarity dulls it. On that morning, the ambition had the quality of something whose time had arrived, not in the sense that history had been building toward this moment, or that what came before had been preparation for this culmination. History does not arrange itself that way, and Plato would have been the first to note the difference between what history actually does and what we wish it had been doing. But there are moments when a particular response to a particular problem takes a form that the problem seems to require. The problem was the death of Socrates, and the form the response took was a school, modest in its physical circumstances, vast in its intellectual ambition, built in the same city that had proven it could not be trusted to protect the work it was intended to continue. The man who founded it had wide shoulders and a name his wrestling coach had given him. He had grown up in a city that believed itself wise and had watched that belief issue in an act that could not be undone. He had traveled and argued and been nearly enslaved and returned and traveled again and returned again, and what he had brought back from all of it was not bitterness, which would have been understandable, and not cynicism, which would have been easy, but something quieter and more durable than either: the capacity to distinguish between what is genuinely known and what only seems to be. This was the inheritance of Socrates, and Plato spent the rest of his long life trying to understand it, teach it, and protect the conditions under which it could be practiced. The grove was quiet in the way that groves outside cities tend to be quiet. The urban noise present, but softened by distance, the trees doing what trees do, the ground holding still beneath the feet of people who had come to ask carefully and without hurry what it might mean to know something well enough to live by it. The academy would stand for centuries after Plato was gone. The questions it housed were older than the institution and would outlast it, but on the morning of its founding, it was enough that the space existed, that the inquiry had a place to occur, that the city's long failure to protect what was best in it had been answered not with anger, but with a building, or rather with a grove, which is older than a building, and in its way more patient. What Plato built there was not a monument to what had been lost. It was a practice in the same key as what had been lost, continued under the conditions that loss had made necessary. The philosopher in the Grove of Academus, watching the first students settle into their first conversations, carried the question that had followed him since the death of his teacher, the question of what it means to truly know something, and what it would take to build a life and a city around knowledge rather than opinion. The question had not become easier. It had become, over the years of travel and failure and return, more clearly his own. And in the shade of the grove, with the city of Athens going about its ordinary business beyond the trees, the question settled into something that felt less like urgency and more like the particular kind of resolve that comes to a person who has understood what they are doing and why, and who has decided to continue. Socrates draws a line, not with a stylus on papyrus, not with chalk on stone, but with a gesture, the kind of gesture a man makes when he wants to show something rather than say it, when the idea has a shape, and the shape is easier to point at than to name. The room is warm. The conversation has been going on for a long time, and into the middle of it, into the air or the dust or the quiet, between one argument and the next, Socrates draws a single line and then cuts it. The cut divides it into two unequal halves. Then each half is divided again in the same proportion, so that four segments appear where one line was, stacked in order, each one standing a little higher than the one below it. The gesture is so spare that the men in the room almost miss the weight of it. A line, four parts. And arranged along those four parts, everything the human mind has ever reached for, every image, every object, every reasoned proof, every glimpse of something that does not change. This is the image Plato places in the 6th book of the Republic, and it is called the divided line. The line is not a ladder built for climbing quickly. It is not a scale from wrong to right. What it maps is something slower and more intimate than a scale, the whole range of ways a human mind can relate to the world, from the most distant and reflected engagement to the most direct, from the haziest grip on what seems to be true to the clearest possible contact with what is. Plato believed these were not just different degrees of knowledge. He believed they were different kinds of knowing altogether, each with its own objects, its own characteristic errors, its own particular ceiling. And to understand the line is not to master it, but to recognize where, in this long range of possible orientations, one tends to stand. The four states are given names in Greek, and the names are worth sitting with, not because the words themselves matter, but because each one captures something that an English translation smooths over. At the bottom, akasia, above it, pistis, then dianoia, and at the summit, noesis. 4 words for 4 different relationships between a mind and the world it is trying to understand. Begin at the bottom with akasia, the state of images and reflections. A man walks through the Athenian agora in the early morning when the stalls are being set up and the air still carries the cool of the night before. He knows every merchant by face, every rumor by its source, every orator by the rhythm of his sentences. He knows who is respected and who is not, who has influence, who is losing it, who said what about whom in the assembly last week. All of this knowledge he holds with great confidence. It has taken years to accumulate. It is, in its own way, an expertise, the expertise of a person who has learned to navigate the world of appearances with genuine skill. What Plato wants to say about this man is not that he is stupid or wrong or immoral. What he wants to say is that the world this man navigates so fluently is a world composed almost entirely of copies of images of things, reflections of reflections, and that the man has never had occasion to notice this, because inside the world of images, the images are indistinguishable from the things themselves. In the Republic, Plato thinks of ikasia in terms of shadows and reflections in water, a shadow cast on the ground, is not the object casting it. A face in a still pool is not the face. But if a person grew up in a place where shadows were all they ever saw, where reflections were all they ever touched, the shadow would seem as solid and real as anything could seem, because there would be nothing to compare it to. This is icosia, not a failure of intelligence, but a failure of orientation, a life organized entirely around appearances, while the realities those appearances are derived from remain unnoticed and unvisited. The rhetor in the agora is a useful figure here. His whole art is the management of impression, the creation of persuasive appearances, the arrangement of words so they seem to mean something true, whether or not they do. He is skilled at reading the mood of an audience and reflecting it back to them in the form of argument. He knows how to make a position seem inevitable, how to make a rival seem confused, how to make himself seem wise without ever encountering the question of whether he actually is. His world is images in motion, and in the world of images he is master. The line begins here because Plato believed this was not an unusual condition or an edge case. He believed it described most people, most of the time, in a city like Athens. Detia is the cognitive state of a civilization organized around reputation rather than character, spectacle rather than substance, the appearance of virtue rather than the slow and invisible work of becoming virtuous. Put it down and leave it there, at the bottom of the line, a world of images, densely inhabited, endlessly busy, utterly confident in its own reality. The second segment of the line, pistis, represents something that feels like a significant step forward, and in some respects it is. Where Icosia's person lives among reflections and shadows, pistis belongs to the person who has moved past the image and is engaging directly with the physical world, the actual objects, actual bodies, actual trees and stones and faces, the things that cast the shadows rather than the shadows themselves. This is the world of everyday perception and ordinary trust. The craftsman who works wood, who knows the grain and the weight and the way certain timbers will split, he is operating in pistis. His knowledge is genuine in its domain. He has moved past the image into contact with the actual material. There is something reliable here that icosia does not have, something that can be tested and corrected against the resistance of real things. And yet, Plato would say, pistis is still not knowledge in the deepest sense. The reason is not that the craftsman is wrong about the wood. The reason is that physical things change. The wood warps, the beautiful body ages, the city that seemed just undergoes a revolution and becomes unjust. Every physical thing that is true of an object at one moment may become false of it at another, and this means that no claim about a physical particular can serve as a stable foundation for genuine understanding. The things of pistis are real things, but they are real in a way that is always conditional, always subject to alteration, always carrying within themselves the possibility of their own contradiction. Plato's concern is not really with wood or stones. It is with justice and beauty and courage, the things that actually matter, the things human beings build their lives and their cities around. If someone says that a particular arrangement of political power is just, meaning this particular city, at this particular moment in its history, the claim is immediately vulnerable to change. The city may shift, the arrangement may be undone, and if someone says that a particular act was courageous, they are pointing at a specific event in time, and specific events in time are the sort of thing that can be described differently, weighted differently, remembered differently. Pistis is belief about the world of specific changing temporal things, And Plato's argument is that because such things are always in process, always becoming something other than what they are, the beliefs about them have the same provisional character. They hold until they don't. They are true until the thing they are about changes. The transition from pistis to dianoia is the most quietly interesting of the three transitions, the one that happens without announcement and without drama. A student sits in the academy, or perhaps in a school before the academy existed, in the workshop of a mathematician, in the company of someone who has spent his life thinking about what numbers actually are. He has been working on geometry. He has been drawing figures, establishing proportions, proving that certain relationships hold between the parts of a triangle, regardless of what the particular triangle looks like, regardless of where it is drawn, regardless of whether it is scratched in sand, or carved in stone, or traced in the air. Something has changed in how he is thinking. He is no longer pointing at particular things that exist in the world and making claims about them. He is reasoning about something that has no particular physical instance, the triangle as such, the relationship between its angles as such, the general truth about all possible triangles rather than about any one of them. He has moved from the visible world to the intelligible world. The objects of his thought are no longer subject to change, decay, or contradiction the way physical objects are. 2 plus 2 was 4 before there was anyone to count it, and will be 4 long after the last fingers have finished their reckoning. This is dianoia, the cognitive mode of the mathematician, the mode that reasons about genuinely abstract entities, genuinely eternal truths, genuinely universal relationships. It is, in Plato's scheme, a genuine assent. The mathematician is not simply believing things about the physical world. He has found objects of thought that are stable in the way the forms are stable, that do not change with the seasons, or the political winds, or the passage of years. But dianoia has a limit, and the limit is this: it begins from hypotheses. It does not examine. The mathematician takes certain things as given. He assumes the existence of points, lines, and planes. He accepts definitions as his starting point and builds from there. He does not ask what a number fundamentally is, or whether the existence of mathematical objects can be justified, or what it means that the mind can grasp truths about objects that have no physical location and no weight. These questions are not mathematical questions. They do not arise inside the practice of geometry, and so the mathematician, for all the rigor and abstraction of his reasoning, stands on ground he has not inspected. There is something else. Even the most abstract mathematician, working on pure proofs with no application in mind, tends to reach for a diagram. He draws the triangle even when he means to be talking about triangles in general. He sketches the circle even when the circle he means is the perfect one that no hand has ever quite drawn. The diagram is a crutch, not a contemptible one, not one that makes his reasoning wrong, but a crutch nonetheless, a small concession to the world of visible things at the very moment he is trying to transcend it. Dianoia moves in the intelligible realm, but it keeps one foot in the visible, one hand still reaching for the diagram, one eye still consulting the drawn figure rather than trusting entirely the undrawn truth. What the mathematician has not yet done is turn and ask about the foundations. What he has not yet done is take the hypotheses themselves as objects of inquiry, press on the definitions rather than building from them, follow the question not forward into proofs, but backward into the ground from which all proof grows. That is the work of the fourth segment of the line, and its name is noesis. Noesis is a word that does not survive translation without losing something. It is usually rendered as pure intellect, or intellectual intuition, or philosophical understanding. What it points at is the mind's direct apprehension of the forms, not the reasoning toward them, not the demonstration of their properties, but the actual cognitive contact with what they are, achieved through the method Plato calls dialectic. Dialectic is not argument in the sense of debate. It is not the kind of reasoning that begins with a premise and builds a case toward a conclusion the listener is meant to accept. It is the kind of inquiry that takes every premise as a question, that treats every hypothesis as something requiring examination rather than a foundation requiring only use. The dialectician is the person who cannot take a starting point for granted, who pushes every definition until it either holds under pressure or reveals its inadequacy, who follows the questions not forward into useful applications, but downward into the structure of things. The goal of this descent, or ascent, depending on how the image is held, is what Plato calls the unhypothetical first principle. This is not an axiom in the mathematical sense, not a convenient starting point the inquirer has agreed not to question. It is the principle that requires no external grounding, because it is the source of its own justification, the point at which the regress of questions stops not because the questioning has grown tired, but because there is genuinely nothing further to ask. Plato identifies this with the form of the good. The form of the good is the summit of the intelligible realm, the point on the divided line that stands above all others. What Plato says about it, in the Republic, through the mouth of Socrates, is that the form of the good occupies the same position among the forms that the sun occupies in the visible world. The sun does not merely exist among the visible things. It is the source of their visibility, the condition that makes it possible to see anything at all. In the same way, the good does not merely exist among the forms. It is the source of their intelligibility, the condition that makes it possible to know anything at all. Plato describes it as beyond being in dignity and power, a phrase that has occupied philosophers ever since, something that does not merely exist, but is the ground of all existence and all knowability. This is the summit of noesis, not a theorem, not a conclusion, not even exactly a discovery, more like an arrival at a vantage point from which everything below becomes clear in a way it was not before. Now hold the whole line together and let the four segments settle into their relationships with each other. At the bottom, ecclesia and its images, the shadow, the reflection, the rhetorical impression, the reputation maintained through carefully managed appearances. Above it, pistis and its physical objects, the things that cast the shadows, the actual bodies, and stones and actions that exist in time and change as time passes. Then dianoia and its abstractions, the mathematical truths that do not change, the universal relationships that no particular instance can exhaust, reasoned rigorously, but from unexamined foundations. And at the summit, nous and its forms, the pure intelligible objects that are not derived from physical things, not dependent on diagrams, not subject to the contingency of the hypotheses beneath them, but simply and eternally what they are. Plato's most important claim about this line is that it is not simply a description of different subjects. It describes different cognitive states, different relationships between the knower and the known. The person at the level of ecclesia is not just looking at different things than the person at the level of nous. The person at the level of ecclesia is a different kind of knower, differently oriented, differently practiced, differently awake or asleep to the question of what counts as real. Moving up the line is not primarily about learning new facts. It is about a change in what counts as evidence, what counts as an answer, what counts as having genuinely understood something. There is a man in the agora who can recite the law of Athens perfectly. He knows the statutes, the precedents, the punishments, the procedures. He can tell you exactly what justice requires in every case the law has anticipated. He is operating, for the most part, somewhere between Icosia and Pistis. His knowledge is of particular rules enacted by particular people at particular times, rules that could in principle be changed tomorrow by a vote. There is another man, say a student who has spent years in philosophical conversation, pressing on every assumption, returning again and again to the question of what justice actually is, rather than what Athens happens to have decided. And this man, if the inquiry has gone deep enough and stayed honest enough, may be approaching the level of dianoia, at minimum, and perhaps something higher. His claim about justice does not depend on what any particular city has decided. It does not change with the political winds. It is grounded in something he has reasoned about carefully, even if he cannot yet say he has fully grasped it. These two men are not separated only by how much they know. They are separated by the kind of knowing they are capable of, by how far down into the structure of things their thinking has been willing to go. One of the quiet tensions running through the divided line is the relationship between the first two segments and the last two. Plato describes the line as divided into a visible half and an intelligible half. Acacia and Pistis belong to the visible realm. They are oriented toward things that can be seen, touched, observed, changed. Dianoia and Noesis belong to the intelligible realm. They are oriented toward things that can only be thought, things that have no physical location, things that the eye cannot find. The transition from the second segment to the third is in Plato's scheme, the crossing from one kind of reality to another. This crossing is easy to name and genuinely difficult to make. Most people throughout most of their lives take the visible world as the measure of the real. Something is real if it can be pointed at, weighed, observed, verified against the evidence of the senses. The mathematicians claim that the diagonal of a unit square cannot be expressed as a ratio of whole numbers, is by this standard a strange kind of knowledge, true, apparently, but true of what exactly? Where is the square whose diagonal is being discussed? Where is the length that cannot be expressed? The physical world produces no instances of mathematical truth, only approximations. And this is precisely Plato's point. The mathematical truth is not less real for having no physical instance. It is more real. It is real in the way that does not depend on the behavior of physical things, and it is therefore the kind of knowledge that can actually support the weight of genuine understanding. The mathematician who draws a diagram to assist his reasoning is not doing something wrong. He is doing something characteristically human, reaching for the visible as a guide to the invisible, using the approximate physical instance to approach the exact intelligible truth it approximates. Plato does not condemn this. What he notices is that the diagram is a starting point, not a destination, and the most serious mathematical thinking eventually releases the diagram, stops consulting the figure, and trusts the proof, stops needing the drawn circle, and works entirely with the concept. Dianoia, then, is the experience of that release, the moment when the mind has moved far enough into abstract reasoning that it can carry the argument without the crutch, when the reasoning has become genuinely its own object, rather than a commentary on something drawn or touched. And noesis is what becomes possible when even the starting assumptions of that reasoning are brought into question, when the philosopher presses not just forward through the proofs, but backward into the foundations, asking not only what follows from the definitions, but whether the definitions themselves are right. The method that makes gnosis possible is dialectic, and Plato's description of it in the Republic is careful about one thing above all others. Dialectic is not a technique that can be learned quickly and applied mechanically. It is a practice of the whole mind, requiring not just intellectual skill, but something like intellectual honesty, the willingness to follow an argument wherever it goes, to set aside the comfort of a conclusion already desired, to hold the question open even when the questioner is tired. The person who engages in genuine dialectic is not trying to win an argument. Winning an argument is an icastic pleasure, the pleasure of making an impression, of being seen to prevail, of accumulating the shadow currency of intellectual reputation. The dialectician is trying to find out what is actually true, and this means being willing to be wrong, willing to watch every hypothesis break, willing to begin again from the rubble of a position that seemed secure and turned out not to be. This is why Plato thought philosophy had to be a practice, not a subject. A subject can be learned from books, retained in memory, recited on demand. A practice requires time, requires the development of habits of mind, requires the slow accumulation of something that is not knowledge in the factual sense, but a particular kind of cognitive character, the capacity to hold uncertainty steadily, to work with incomplete understanding, to return again and again to questions that do not yield easily. In the academy that Plato founded, mathematics was required study, not because Plato wanted his students to become mathematicians, but because he believed the practice of mathematics developed the cognitive habits that philosophical reasoning requires, the ability to reason about objects that cannot be seen, the discipline of following an argument to its conclusion, even when the conclusion is counterintuitive, the experience of working with truths that do not depend on empirical observation. Mathematics was preparation, dianoia in service of noesis, the third segment of the line pointing toward the fourth. The inscription said to have stood at the entrance of the academy, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here," whether or not it was literally inscribed in stone, captures something real about Plato's vision of the line. Geometry was not the end point. It was the discipline through which a mind learned to trust what it could not see, to follow what it could not touch, to treat the invisible as more real than the visible. And once a mind had learned to do this in the safe and rigorous context of mathematics, it was better prepared to do it in the more difficult and less certain context of ethics and politics and metaphysics, where the truths are harder to grasp, and the temptation to settle for the visible is stronger. Hold the line now in a slightly different way. Each segment of the line corresponds not only to a cognitive state, but to a characteristic kind of error, a way of being wrong that is specific to the level of the line on which one stands. The ecastic error is confusing the image for the thing. The pistis error is confusing the changing particular for the stable universal. The dianetic error is confusing a well-reasoned deduction from unexamined hypotheses for genuine understanding. These errors are not random failures. They are systematically generated by the level at which one is operating, by the kind of object one takes as the measure of the real. The man who navigates the agora by reputation, by who is admired and who is not, by who the crowd has turned toward and who it has turned away from, commits the ecastic error whenever he uses that reputation as a guide to actual virtue. He confuses the image, the social standing, with the thing, the character. And because he is expert at navigating images, he is in no position to notice the error. The error is invisible from inside the level at which it operates. The person who believes the beautiful body before them is beauty, who takes the particular instance for the general truth, who forgets that the body will change, while insisting that beauty cannot be this transient thing, commits the pistis error. She is engaging with something real, something that has crossed the threshold from shadow into substance. But she is stopping short of the question that would press her further, the question of what makes the body beautiful at all, what the standard is to which it is being compared, what remains constant while the particular changes. The mathematician who takes the axiom for granted, who builds an elegant and rigorous proof from foundations he has never examined, who would be flustered and confused if someone asked why the parallel postulate should be accepted rather than questioned. This person is at the Dianetic level, committing the Dianetic error, reasoning impeccably within a structure whose own validity has not been tested. Plato does not present these as failures to be ashamed of. He presents them as stages in a natural progression, moments in the development of a mind that is orienting itself toward more and more reality, making errors that are appropriate to its current level of development and that can only be corrected by continuing to move. The acastic error corrects itself when the person turns from the image toward the object. The pistis error corrects itself when the mind learns to ask after universals rather than particulars. The Dianetic error corrects itself when the philosopher turns and asks about the foundations. And the noetic error, if there is one, the error specific to the summit of the line, would perhaps be the belief that the apprehension of the form is a permanent acquisition, a destination arrived at and maintained without effort, a state of understanding that settles once and for all. But Plato is too honest a thinker and too honest a writer to suggest that any human being simply arrives at noesis and remains there. The dialogues are full of moments where the argument seemed to hold and then didn't, where the understanding that seemed secure turned out to have another question hiding inside it, where the philosopher returned to the beginning, not in defeat, but in the spirit of beginning again, more carefully. Nokesis, as Plato describes it, is less a state to be achieved than a direction to be maintained, the direction in which the soul is turned when it is oriented correctly, when the whole apparatus of the mind is pointed toward what is real rather than toward what merely appears. And the divided line is less a map of fixed positions than a description of that ongoing orientation of what it looks like when the mind is turned toward the shadow and what it looks like when it is turned toward the sun. There is something in this image that refuses to become static. The line does not end at noseus in the sense of coming to rest there permanently. It ends in the way a path ends at a high point, not because there is nowhere further to go, but because from this point the whole path below becomes visible in a way it was not, while one was walking it. The person who has moved even a little way in the direction of dianoia can look back at icosia and understand something about it that was invisible from inside it. The person who has spent time pressing on the hypotheses of mathematics, who has begun to ask the questions dialectic asks, understands something about the nature of mathematical knowledge that the working mathematician does not need to ask about, and therefore has not thought to ask. The line is not a verdict on anyone's current position. It is a description of what becomes possible as the mind moves, as it learns to trust what it cannot touch, to question what it has taken for granted, to follow an argument backward into its foundations and forward into its implications with equal patience. All of these movements are slow. None of them are dramatic. The movement from icosia to pistis is not a crisis, but a noticing, the gradual recognition that the shadows in the agora are shadows of something, that the reputation of a man is not the same as his character, that what people think and what is true have a relationship that requires examination. The movement from pistis to dianoia is a loosening, the moment when a mind that has trusted its hands and its eyes begins to find that there are true things neither the hands nor the eyes can reach. This is a strange experience and an uncomfortable one. The hands are confident instruments. The eyes are used to being right about the objects they observe. And for a mind that has organized itself around the reliability of sensory contact, the discovery that some truths have no sensory form at all requires a kind of adjustment that is less like learning a fact and more like revising a habit of expectation. Something loosens, the grip of the visible relaxes, and in the relaxation, something else becomes available, not yet the forms, not yet noesis, but the experience of reasoning about things that stay what they are, regardless of whether anyone is looking at them. And this is perhaps the deepest thing the divided line offers. Not a map of achievement or a scale of intellectual rank, but a description of what it feels like to move from one relationship with the real to another, to release the image and find the object, to release the object and find the universal, to release the hypothesis and find, or try to find, or orient oneself toward finding the ground from which the hypotheses grow. Each release requires something. Each one leaves something behind. And what is left behind is not something that was never real, but something whose reality was partial, contingent, dependent on conditions that can change. The line settles into stillness. Socrates has drawn his line and left it in the air. The men in the room have held it for a while, turned it in their minds, noticed where they tend to stand on it. Not everyone who hears the description will recognize themselves clearly in any one segment. The line is not a taxonomy of types, but a single range of orientation, and the honest student of it tends to find that he stands in different places on different days, in different conversations, depending on the question and the quality of attention he has brought to it. What the line describes, in the end, is a direction, not a position, but a direction. The direction a mind faces when it has begun to ask, seriously and without impatience, what it actually means to know something, what counts as the kind of understanding that is not merely belief, not merely impression, not merely the skillful navigation of appearances, but the real contact of a mind with what is genuinely real. This question does not demand an immediate answer. It does not require the listener to climb anywhere tonight or to condemn the level at which they currently stand. It requires only the thing it has always required, the thing Plato's line was drawn to invite, the quiet willingness to face the question of what the mind is actually touching and to keep facing it patiently for as long as the inquiry takes. The four segments rest in their order: images, objects, mathematical truths, the forms themselves. And somewhere along this line, at whatever point the mind finds itself tonight, the direction remains the same, toward the more real, toward the less contingent, toward the kind of understanding that does not shift with the season or the crowd, not with urgency, not with pressure, simply as a direction. The well-ordered mind, given time and quiet, inclines toward on its own, the way a line, when extended far enough, eventually finds its proper length. Imagine, Socrates says, he is sitting in a room in Athens, in the middle of a long conversation that has already moved through justice and the soul and the proper ordering of a city, and now he pauses, and the word he chooses is that one, imagine. Not a command, and not quite an invitation either, something closer to what a guide says at the edge of a place that cannot be described from the outside, but only entered. The men around him are listening. The afternoon, or the evening, or whatever hour it is in that room and that dialogue, settles around the word, and then he begins. There is an underground dwelling, he says, a cave, and in it, since childhood, people have been sitting with their backs to the entrance, their necks turned by chains so that they can face only the wall in front of them. Behind them, further up toward the mouth of the cave, a fire burns. Between the fire and the prisoners, other people walk along a raised path, carrying objects held up above the wall that lines that path. Figures of animals, of people, of things, and the fire throws the shadows of these objects forward onto the wall that the prisoners have faced for as long as they can remember. The prisoners see the shadows. They hear the echoes of voices bouncing off the stone. And because this has always been so, because there is no memory older than this arrangement, and no horizon wider than this wall, the shadows are not shadows to them. They are the things themselves. They are reality. They are all that reality has ever been. The image arrives quietly, the way all of Plato's deepest images arrive, not with a fanfare, but with the slight chill of recognition, as though the story is describing something one has already half known. What makes the cave a prison is not visible from inside it. This is the first and in some ways most important thing Socrates wants his companions to understand. There is no suffering in the cave, or not the kind of suffering that announces itself. The fire is warm, the shadows have names, and the prisoners are skilled at naming them. There is even something like mastery available there. The one who can predict which shadow will follow which, who has memorized the rhythms of the wall's display well enough to anticipate what comes next. That person is honored among the others. Their fluency is real. Their expertise has been earned by long attention. The cave rewards this kind of intelligence, the intelligence that works with what the wall provides, that reads the surface with increasing sophistication and calls the reading knowledge. And perhaps it is a kind of knowledge in the same way that a person who has never left a single valley might know the valley better than any traveler who passes through. The difficulty is not the knowing. The difficulty is the believing that the valley is the whole of what there is to know. Plato does not call the prisoners foolish. He does not call them failed or broken. He says they are like us, which in the Greek that Socrates is speaking is a comparison made with a kind of matter-of-fact precision, the way a physician names a condition that is widespread and has a cause and is not a moral failing. The cave is not a place unusual people end up through some particular weakness. It is the default condition of a life lived without philosophy. It is where most people live most of the time, in the sense that most orientation toward the world is orientation toward images of things rather than things themselves, toward reputation rather than virtue, toward the shifting appearances of justice rather than whatever justice actually is. The cave is ordinary. That is what makes it so difficult to leave. Now Socrates asks his companions to imagine something further. Imagine that one of the prisoners is released. Imagine that the chains are removed and the prisoner is turned, made to stand, made to face the fire. The turning is painful from the first. The neck, long fixed in one direction, resists. The legs, unused to standing, are unsteady. And the firelight, which from behind had served only as the unseen source of familiar shadows, now falls directly on the prisoner's eyes as something overwhelming and strange. The objects carried past the wall are not recognizable as the originals of the shadows the prisoner has spent a life learning to name. They are too solid, too particular, too bright against the fire. Where the shadows were smooth and simple, the objects cast them from are complex and three-dimensional and harder to read. Everything the prisoner knew, The whole repertoire of expertise and mastery accumulated over years of facing the wall does not help here. It is worse than useless. The prisoner, freed, is less capable than before. The freed prisoner performs worse at the tasks of perception than the still chained ones. This, Socrates says, is what the beginning of knowledge feels like. Not clarification, not relief. Disorientation, a temporary reduction in the capacity to make sense of what is there. It is worth dwelling on this, the way Plato dwells on it, without hurry. The early stages of philosophical movement do not feel like progress, they feel like confusion. The person who first begins to question the categories they have been given, who starts to wonder whether reputation is the same as virtue, whether popular agreement is the same as truth, whether the laws they have inherited encode justice or only encode the preferences of those who made them. That person does not experience the questioning as an arrival at clarity. The ground shifts. The certainties that organize life stop organizing it. What was reliable becomes suspect. The questions do not come with answers attached, and the people who remain at the wall are still fluent, still successful at the things the cave rewards, and the questioner, at this early stage, cannot easily explain why their discomfort is not simply ignorance. The freed prisoner is not at the open air yet. The prisoner is still inside the cave, still lit only by the fire, and the fire is still painful to look at directly. This is the middle distance between the wall and the exit, and it is a real place with its own difficulties. Now, imagine, Socrates continues, that someone takes this prisoner and drags them, the word he uses is drag, or something like it, forcible, uncomfortable, upward through the cave toward the opening, upward and toward the light, and the light increases as they go. At first, it is simply more of what was already difficult, more brightness, more disorientation, more of the feeling that comes from having one's eyes asked to do something they have never done. The exit arrives not as a threshold that resolves anything, but as an increase of the very problem. The outside light, which is sunlight, is not the fire's orange warmth. It is something else entirely, something without a visible source, something that seems to come from everywhere at once, and the eyes that have lived by firelight and before that by shadow light cannot bear it. The prisoner stumbles out, blinks, looks down. The ground is there, solid and lit, but looking at it still involves light, reflected from everything the sun touches, and even the ground is brighter than anything the cave contained. Looking at objects is too much. Looking at the sky is impossible. There is a moment, and Plato describes it carefully, when what the prisoner can bear to look at is not things themselves, but their reflections. The image of a tree in still water, the shape of a mountain caught in a lake's surface. Reflections are dimmer than the things they reflect. They are one step removed from the full light of the real, and so the prisoner approaches the outside world the way a careful thinker approaches any overwhelming truth, obliquely, through an intermediary, through something that gives the eyes time to adjust before they are asked to bear the full weight of what is actually there. Plato is precise about these intermediate stages because they are not failures of courage or intelligence. They are the proper order of a real process. The philosopher does not arrive at truth by simply deciding to look at it directly. The philosopher arrives at truth through the patient work of approaching it in the right sequence, allowing the mind's capacity for direct perception to develop gradually, the way the eyes must develop their tolerance for increasing light. There is no shortcut here. The oblique approach is not weakness, it is method. After a time, the prisoner can look at the objects themselves, not their reflections, but the actual trees, the actual hills, the actual faces of other people who live in the sunlit world. And then, last of all, at night, the prisoner looks up, looks at the stars, at the moon, at the sky, and finally, when enough time has passed and the capacity is ready, looks at the sun itself. Socrates is very quiet about what happens at this moment. He does not describe a blinding or an ecstasy. He describes something closer to comprehension, a slow understanding that the sun is not just one more thing in the world of visible things, but the thing by which all the other things are visible, the source of the seasons, the cause of the year, the origin, in some sense, of everything that grows and lives and changes in the world above the cave. The prisoner, looking at the sun, understands something about the structure of the world that the wall could never have provided, not because the wall was false exactly, but because the wall was downstream of the sun by several removes, and no amount of expertise in reading the downstream could reveal what was happening at the source. The sun, in the story, is Plato's image for the form of the good, not a single truth among others, not the highest item in a ranked list, something more structural than that, the thing whose presence makes truth available at all, the way the sun's presence makes the visible world available to sight. In the intelligible realm of the forms, the good occupies the position the sun occupies in the sky, prior to everything that can be known, the condition under which knowing itself becomes possible. Plato says in Book 6 that the form of the good is beyond being in dignity and power, which is not mystical speech, but a careful claim that the good is not one more thing that exists alongside other things, but rather that by which everything else has whatever reality and intelligibility it possesses. To know the good is not to know one more fact. It is to know what makes facts possible. This is a thought that the cave could not have generated, not because the cave dwellers were unintelligent, but because the kind of thinking that generates it requires having moved through the stages of approach, through the intermediate reflections, through the direct perception of particular real things, through the long patience of an ascent that feels, at each stage, more exposing than the one before it. The good cannot be arrived at by a shortcut from the wall. The ascent is the thinking. Now comes the part of the story that Socrates seems to want his companions to sit with longest. The philosopher returns to the cave, not driven back, or not only driven back. The philosopher descends, goes back down through the passage, back toward the firelight, back into the space where people are still sitting with their chains, still naming shadows, still honoring the one among them who can predict which shadow follows which. And when the philosopher arrives in the cave again, something happens that is the precise inverse of what happened on the way out. The eyes that have grown accustomed to sunlight are now asked to adjust to darkness, to firelight, to the dim flicker of shadows on a stone wall, and they cannot do it quickly. The philosopher in the cave performs badly. The philosopher squints and stumbles, and names the shadows wrong, or is slow at naming them, slower than the prisoners who never left. The mastery the philosopher once had at the wall, whatever skill at shadow naming they possessed before the ascent, has atrophied in the sunlight. They are, in the practical terms the cave recognizes, worse at the things the cave values than those who stayed. Plato is not romanticizing the philosopher's position here. He is describing an actual condition, and the condition is genuinely uncomfortable. The person who has spent time outside the cave does not come back to it as a confident expert. They come back to it blinking and slow, and the people they return to have no reason, from within the cave's own terms, to respect or trust them. The philosopher cannot offer the cave what the cave wants: more fluency at the wall, because the philosopher's attention has been trained on something the cave does not contain and cannot see. And yet the philosopher knows something, not something that translates easily into shadow naming. Something about the structure of the place itself, about what the shadows are shadows of, about why the fire burns where it does, and what the whole arrangement is, and where the exit lies. This knowledge is real. It simply has no immediate use in the currency the cave trades in. Plato wrote this allegory after Socrates was dead. He wrote it after the city had looked at its wisest citizen and found him incomprehensible and dangerous, someone who stumbled through the agora, asking questions that disrupted the city's confidence in its own shadow naming, someone who performed poorly by the standards the Democratic Assembly valued, and yet claimed to be performing a service the city could not do without. The allegory carries this weight without making a speech about it. The figure of the philosopher stumbling in the returned darkness is close enough to the figure of Socrates stumbling through Athenian politics that anyone who knows the history can feel the resonance. Plato does not underline it. He does not need to. What Plato does instead is take the allegory somewhere surprising. He does not end it with the philosopher's exile from the cave. He ends it with the philosopher's return, and with what that return means as an obligation. The one who has seen the sun does not simply remain in the upper world contemplating the light. The philosopher comes back, not because coming back is comfortable or rewarding by the cave's own standards, because the ones in the cave are still there, and the philosopher knows things they do not, and the knowing creates a responsibility that the philosopher, if they are a philosopher in the fullest sense, cannot simply set aside. The knowledge is not a possession to be enjoyed privately. It is a direction to be shared, however imperfectly, however slowly, however much the sharing looks from the outside, like a person stumbling around in the dark and claiming to know where the light is. This is where Plato's picture of education lives, not in the transmission of information from a full vessel to an empty one. That image, the teacher pouring knowledge into the student, the way water is poured into a cup, Plato explicitly rejects. Education is not filling, it is turning. The word he uses in the Greek points toward a reorientation of the whole person, a rotation of the soul's fundamental direction, so that what was facing the wall begins to face the fire, and then begins to face the exit, and then begins the long, patient climb toward the light. The soul already has what it needs to see. The capacity for vision is there. The question is which direction the soul is facing. And education, in Plato's account, is the art of the turning, of creating the conditions in which a soul that has been facing one direction begins, slowly, to face another. This is not something that can be done quickly. The turning Plato imagines does not happen in a lesson or a course of study. It happens in a life. It happens through the long accumulation of philosophical questioning, through dialogue, through the patient testing of assumptions, and the honest acknowledgement of what is found when the testing is done. It happens through the particular human experience of having one's certainties disrupted and surviving the disruption, of finding that the confusion that follows the loss of a familiar certainty is not the end of thinking, but the beginning of thinking that goes somewhere new. The cave is left by stages. There is no other way. And so the cave allegory is, among other things, an account of time, of the time education takes, of the patience required of anyone who wants to move from the wall toward the light, and of anyone who wants to help others make that movement. Socrates, in the Platonic picture, had this patience. He had it for decades. He stood in the agora and asked questions year after year, not delivering lectures, not handing down conclusions, but creating the conditions in which the people he spoke with might, if they were willing, begin to turn. Some of them did, many of them did not. Some of them became so uncomfortable with the turning that they preferred to eliminate the person doing the turning rather than continue to be turned. And Plato, watching all of this, watching the death of the man who had turned him, wrote a story about people in a cave who cannot understand what the philosopher is doing and find the philosopher's presence disturbing rather than illuminating. But the story does not end with the philosopher's death or the cave's refusal. It ends with the philosopher still there, still in the cave, still among the people who do not yet understand what is available to them, still doing the work of the turning, still blinking in the dark, still accepting the slowness and the disorientation and the gap between what the philosopher knows and what the cave can currently receive, still present, because presence is what the knowledge demands. There is something in this image that is very quiet and very old. Plato imagined it in the 4th century, before the Common Era, in the aftermath of a death he carried all his life, and it has not lost its clarity in all the centuries since. The philosopher in the cave is not a triumphant figure, not a hero, not someone whose vindication is coming. The philosopher is someone who has seen something and come back to say so, knowing the saying will be imperfect, and the hearing imperfect, and the understanding imperfect, and who has decided that none of these imperfections constitute a reason to stop. The fire is still burning in the cave. The shadows are still moving on the wall. Somewhere above, the sun that the prisoners cannot see is illuminating everything that grows and changes in a world they have not yet stood in. And somewhere in the cave, among the chains and the familiar shapes, the philosopher sits down again, eyes still adjusting, still slower than the others, at the naming, carrying something that has no name in the cave's language, but that the cave, in time, might be ready to receive. The darkness of the cave is not cold. The fire sees to that. And the philosopher sitting again among the people who do not yet know what the philosopher knows is not despairing. The word that comes closest to what they are, in this moment and in all the moments like it, is patient. Patient in the way of someone who has seen that the light is real and has not forgotten the fact of the exit, and who understands that waiting here at the level of the wall beside the people who are still naming shadows is not a defeat, it is the work. It has always been the work, and the work, slow and imperfect and conducted in the flickering half-dark of ordinary life, is the only way the turning ever happens at all. The shadows continue their movement across the stone. The fire holds its place. The exit, somewhere behind and above, remains open to the dark sky and the stars and the sun that will rise again whenever it rises, illuminating without effort everything it touches, asking nothing of the things it makes visible, simply there, the way the deepest truths in Plato's world are simply there, waiting, without impatience, for the eyes that will one day be ready to bear them. In the academy, sometime in the middle years of the 4th century before the Common Era, Plato is sitting with a small group of students, not in formal arrangement, but in the easy proximity of people who have been thinking together long enough to think comfortably in silence. The light is the particular light of an Athenian afternoon, warm and slightly oblique, falling across the low ground near the grove of Academus, where the olive trees are old enough to cast real shade. Someone has asked a question about a friend. Not a philosophical question, exactly, more the kind of observation that precedes one, a remark about the way a particular person carried themselves, something in the bearing that made them seem not merely presentable, but genuinely beautiful, in a way that was difficult to account for and easy to recognize. Plato pauses before answering. What he reaches for is not an explanation, but a distinction, and the distinction, once drawn, will take the rest of his life to fully trace. The face of a friend, he says, is one thing, the beauty they seem to carry is another. This is where the entire architecture begins, not in abstraction, not in argument, but in the gap between a face and what the face appears to hold. The face will change. Anyone who has watched time work on the people they love already knows this without being told. The cheekbones shift. The light in the eyes dims. What was once instantly recognizable becomes an approximation of itself, and still the person who has known that face a long time will say, honestly and without sentiment, they are still beautiful. Something has persisted through the change. Something was present when the face was young and will be present in a different register when the face is old, and this something cannot be identical to the face itself, because the face and this something do not move in the same direction through time at the same pace. Plato has been sitting with this observation for a long time. The theory that emerges from it is not a comfortable theory, exactly, but it is a theory that answers a question almost no other theory has tried to answer cleanly. The question is, what are we actually recognizing when we recognize something beautiful? Not liking, not preferring. Recognizing as though the beautiful thing is displaying a credential, as though there is something it is showing us that we can read, and that, when we read it correctly, we do not feel surprised but confirmed. The confirmation is the clue. When a thing strikes us as genuinely beautiful, something in the encounter functions less like discovery and more like meeting something already partly known, a standard being satisfied, a proportion held, a quality present that we were in some sense already waiting to find. Plato asks what that standard is. He asks where it lives, if not in the thing itself, since the thing itself is always changing. He asks how it is that we carry this capacity for recognition with us, reliably, across all the different particular beautiful things in the world, and he finds that he cannot explain any of it without positing something that is not subject to the same changes as the particular things, something the particular things borrow, something they reflect, each in its own way, imperfectly and temporarily, the way a lake reflects the light of a sky it does not own. This is the first formal premise of what Plato will call the theory of forms, and in the long stretch of his working life, he will return to it, refine it, press it against objections, and find it, in its essentials, unabandoned. There are, he holds, two realms. The visible realm is the world that comes to awareness through the body, through sight and hearing and touch and taste, through the impressions that sensory experience delivers and that the unreflective mind takes, by default, as the whole of reality. This realm is real in its way. The face is real. The olive tree outside the academy is real. The warm afternoon light is real. But everything in this realm is in motion. Everything is subject to change and decay and contradiction, and nothing in it can ground stable universal knowledge, because the moment you say this is beautiful, the this has already shifted slightly from what it was when you began the sentence, and the beauty you are attributing to it is a quality that in this realm comes and goes without remainder. What you can have, at best, from engagement with this realm is doxa, a word usually translated as opinion or belief, a word that carries with it the weight of genuine engagement, but not of final stability. Doxa is not ignorance, it is not careless. It is the honest result of serious attention to a world that does not hold still long enough to be fully known. The intelligible realm is different in kind, not different in degree, not a slightly more refined version of the sensory world, but different in the most fundamental way available to a metaphysical distinction. The forms that inhabit this realm are eternal. They do not change. They do not decay. They are not anywhere in physical space, and they do not occupy any particular moment in time, which means that nothing that happens in time and space can threaten their existence or alter their nature. Beauty itself is as it is, regardless of what happens to any beautiful thing. Justice itself holds its structure, regardless of what any particular law or custom enacts. The form of equality is not affected by the fact that two sticks held side by side are never perfectly equal and never will be. These things are not abstractions in the pejorative sense, not merely concepts, not merely mental habits, not merely linguistic conventions that human beings have found useful. They are, for Plato, more real than anything in the visible realm, because real, properly understood, means what persists, what maintains itself, what does not bend to circumstance and fade. Only the intelligible realm yields what Plato means by episteme, knowledge in the full sense, the kind of knowing that is stable and universal and cannot be overturned by a change in the weather or the opinion of a crowd. The distance between these two realms is not merely a philosophical nicety. Plato is quite serious about what it costs to misplace them, to treat the visible realm as though it were the intelligible, to mistake the face for the beauty, the law for justice, the diagram for the geometric truth. An entire political philosophy grows from this distinction, and not a gentle one. If what most people call knowledge is, on Plato's account, only opinion, if even the most apparently successful people in a democratic city are operating at the level of doxa about the things that matter most, then the question of who should govern becomes sharper than most democracies are comfortable with. The person who governs by opinion, however well-intentioned, is like a navigator reading the weather by the color of the water rather than by the stars. The water changes, the stars do not. But this is the political edge of the theory, and it sharpens best in other rooms. What matters here in the warm afternoon of the academy is the metaphysical structure itself, the two realms, the two cognitive modes, and the question that runs between them like a current. That question is, how does a physical thing in the visible realm relate to the form that makes it what it is? Plato has several names for this relationship across his dialogues. He calls it participation, he calls it imitation, he calls it presence, he calls it resemblance. The multiplicity of his vocabulary here is not carelessness but honesty, an acknowledgement that he is pointing at a genuine philosophical puzzle and that none of his formulations quite captures it. The face participates in beauty itself. The just act imitates justice itself. The form of equality is somehow present in the two equal sticks. The sticks resemble equality itself. Each of these formulations does something useful. None of them fully survives close scrutiny. And Plato knows this, which is why, in one of the most philosophically candid moments in all of his dialogues, he stages the scrutiny himself. In the Parmenides, a dialogue Plato writes when he is already well into his working life, there is a scene that operates as a kind of philosophical stress test of his own central theory. The young Socrates depicted here, unusually as a student rather than a teacher, is put through his paces by the older philosopher Parmenides, who has arrived in Athens from Elea with a companion named Zeno. Socrates has just sketched with the confidence of youth the basic structure of the theory of forms. He is articulate about it. He is in his way compelling. And Parmenides listens and then begins to ask questions. The argument Parmenides presses, the one that will be carried forward and sharpened into what Aristotle later calls the third man argument, runs something like this. If what makes two large things large is their sharing in the form of largeness, then to explain the relationship between those two things and the form, we need to posit another form in which all three participate. And to explain the relationship between those three things and the new form, we need to posit yet another. The logic does not stop. It generates, without apparent limit, an infinite regress of forms, each required to explain the relationship between the ones below it, which means that the original two large things are in the end explained by nothing, because the explanation has dissolved into an infinite series of further required explanations that never reaches ground. The young Socrates in the dialogue does not have an answer. He shifts, he tries alternative formulations. He suggests that maybe forms are like thoughts in a mind, or like patterns that things copy. Parmenides meets each alternative with a new difficulty, patient and precise, not unkind, but entirely thorough. And what is philosophically remarkable about this dialogue is not that the young Socrates is bested. He is young, and the dialogue is partly about that, but that Plato, writing the whole scene, clearly understood the force of the objection. He is not softening it. He is not providing an exit. He is setting down with unusual frankness a serious difficulty inside his own most important theory, and leaving it there, visible, for anyone who wants to find it. This is worth pausing on, not as a symptom of theoretical failure, but as a philosophical gesture of a particular kind, a mind that writes its own best objections into a dialogue, that gives the counter-argument its full weight, and then does not resolve it cleanly, is a mind that has decided something important, that the truth of the theory is not more important than the truth of the difficulty. Plato does not seem to think the third man argument destroys the theory. He seems to think it marks a genuine puzzle about the relationship between particulars and forms, the puzzle of participation, that the theory has not yet found a way to fully address. The theory remains. The puzzle remains. They sit in proximity, neither canceling the other. Aristotle, who came to the academy as a student and stayed for 2 decades, would press the objection harder. He would find, in the third man argument and in related difficulties, sufficient reason to reject the entire ontological framework of separate transcendent forms, and to locate his own universals in the things themselves rather than in a separate intelligible realm. But the shape of Aristotle's disagreement is in its own way a measure of how seriously he took the theory he disagreed with. You press hard against things that matter. The objection is, among other things, a form of respect. The form of beauty, though, is where the theory is felt most fully, and where the dry language of ontology and episteme gives way to something warmer. In the symposium, a dialogue set at a drinking party in celebration of the playwright Agathon's victory at a dramatic festival, the conversation turns to eros, to love, to what desire is, and where it leads. The company agrees, in the way of people who have been drinking thoughtfully, to give speeches in praise of love. Most of the speeches are elegant, some are beautiful. Socrates, when his turn comes, does something different. He reports a conversation, told in the past tense, with a woman named Diotima, a priestess and philosopher from Mantinea, whom he credits as his teacher in the matters of love. Diotima does not enter the room. She arrives through Socrates' memory, her voice a step removed from the present, which gives everything she says a quality of something received from a distance, a teaching that has traveled some way to reach its current listener, retaining warmth without the immediate force of presence. And what she teaches is an account of eros that begins where it is easiest to begin, in the ordinary human experience of finding another person beautiful, and then follows that experience to its most extreme logical consequence, The person who loves a beautiful body, she says, is not wrong to love it. The love is real, the beauty is real, but a person capable of genuine philosophical progress will notice something about that love, that the quality they are responding to in this particular body is not entirely exclusive to this body. They can recognize the same quality in other bodies. The beauty is not the person's private property. It belongs in some sense to a larger category that this person exemplifies but does not exhaust. The, once this is noticed, the lover capable of assent begins to love, with less urgency and more breadth, the quality itself as it appears across all beautiful bodies, and something in the quality of the love changes. It does not diminish, it expands. The love has become less like possession and more like recognition. From all beautiful bodies, Diotima's account moves outward. The person who loves beautiful bodies, if they are following the thread carefully, will find that the beauty of souls, the beauty of genuine character, of intellectual clarity, of moral courage, of the particular grace of a well-ordered mind, is of the same kind as the beauty they have been responding to in bodies, and is, if anything, more compelling because it is less subject to the changes that the body undergoes. The beautiful soul is beautiful in a way that the beautiful body is trying to be but cannot quite manage, because the body is in the visible realm and the soul has access to something the body does not. From beautiful souls, the ascent continues to beautiful practices and laws and forms of organization, where the same structural quality appears at a social and institutional scale. Then to beautiful knowledge, the knowledge of the sciences and mathematics and philosophy, where the beauty is no longer in a person or a practice, but in a purely intellectual form, a shape of understanding that holds itself together with a particular rightness. For each step has been an expansion, a loosening of what love was capable of holding, a gradual increase in the size of what can be loved, and then, at the end of the ascent, the final step, a vision of beauty itself, not beauty in a face, not beauty in a soul, not beauty in a mathematical proof, but the thing itself, absolute, pure, unmixed with any particular instance of it, not beautiful here and ugly there, not beautiful for now and fading later, not beautiful from one angle and ordinary from another, earn the form of beauty, held steadily in intellectual vision. This is what all of the previous steps have been preparation for, what all of the previous loves have been, in their different registers, reaching toward. And what Diotima says about what happens to a life that has arrived at this vision is not that it becomes cold or abstract or detached from particular things. She says very quietly that only here is the life worth living. The form is not the enemy of the particular beautiful things. It is what makes them possible, what gives them whatever beauty they have, what the particular instances are always, imperfectly and lovingly attempting. The ascent Diotima describes is not a renunciation, it is an expansion. Each step enlarges what can be loved, rather than abandoning the previous object. The beautiful face is not left behind so much as held within a larger understanding of what was beautiful about it and why. The love that reaches the form of beauty is not a colder love, but a more informed one, the same vector that moved through ordinary attraction, widened and clarified until it can hold not just one face, but the entire structure that all beautiful faces are reaching toward. Eros, in this account, is not merely a feeling, it is a directional force. Diotima speaks of it not as a god, but as a daemon, one of those intermediate figures who move between the divine and the human, carrying messages, mediating between realms. Eros is between beauty and the longing for beauty, between having and not having, between fullness and lack. And this position between is what gives it its peculiar character. The lover always lacks. The lover is always moving. Even in your saddle word, the lover is not satisfied by what they have, because the form they are actually responding to is not fully given in any particular instance of it. This is not a tragedy in Diotima's account. It is the engine of everything. The incompleteness is the force. The lack is what drives the ascent. And the ascent, Plato believes, is genuine philosophical progress, not metaphorically, but literally. The person who follows Eros all the way to the form of beauty has achieved something epistemological. They have arrived through the long education of their desire at genuine knowledge, not opinion, not well-formed belief, knowledge of the kind that rests in the intelligible realm and does not shift with circumstance. The philosopher who has loved their way to the form of beauty knows something that no amount of careful empirical observation could have produced, because careful empirical observation, however thorough, remains entirely within the visible realm, where beauty as such never appears. The form of justice, which occupies a central place in the Republic, arrives by a different route, but has the same essential character. It is not a law. It is not a social contract. It is not an arrangement that human beings have found convenient and agreed to call justice, the way they might agree on a standard unit of measurement. It is a structural principle, something like the relationship of proper order between parts of a whole, the condition under which each part performs its specific function without encroaching on the function of any other. When a city is just, it is because each of its parts, those who reason, those who defend, those who provide material sustenance, is doing what it is fitted to do, and the whole coheres in the way that only properly proportioned things cohere. When a person is just, the same structure holds at an interior scale. The rational part of the soul directs, the spirited part supports, the appetitive part is satisfied within its proper compass, and the person who results from this ordering is not a diminished or repressed person, but a free one, free in the only sense Plato thinks the word can honestly bear. The philosopher who knows the form of justice knows this structural principle as a direct intellectual apprehension of the form, not as a derivation from particular just acts, not as an inference from social convention, but as a direct knowing of the eternal structure itself. This is why, in the political argument of the Republic, only the philosopher who has achieved gnosis of the form of justice is truly qualified to govern justly, not because they are better at reading public opinion, not because they are more technically skilled in legal procedure, but because they know in the full sense what justice is, and this knowledge places them in a different relationship to every particular question of governance than anyone who has not made the ascent. This is admittedly not a view that has found comfortable residence in democratic political theory. The idea that most people are operating at the level of opinion about the most important political questions, that democratic deliberation is on Plato's account a competition between different forms of doxa rather than an approach to truth, has troubled readers of the Republic from antiquity to the present. The trouble is not groundless, but the trouble comes from a place that takes the theory seriously, which is perhaps the most Platonic response available. A room in the academy again, later in the afternoon. The students have been talking for some time. The particular question that prompted the original distinction, the remark about the friend's beauty, has long since dissolved into the broader question it was always pointing toward. Someone asks about the diagram a student has scratched in the dust near the edge of the floor. A circle, not quite perfect, its circumference slightly uneven in one quadrant. The circle the geometer means, when they speak of circles, Plato says, is not this circle. It has never been any drawn circle. Every drawn circle is an approximation, a reaching towards something that no physical line can achieve. The circle of geometry, perfectly round, without thickness, without beginning or end, exists only in the intelligible realm. It is the object the geometer's mind is actually engaging when the reasoning about circles holds. This is not a small point about geometry. It is a demonstration of the same structure the theory of forms has been pointing at throughout. The diagram is in the visible realm, but what the mathematician knows is in the intelligible realm, and the knowledge works because the mathematical mind can, with effort, detach itself from the particular drawn circle and engage with the form directly. The diagram is an aid. It is not the object. The geometer who confuses them is working at a lower level than they might be. But even the geometer who does confuse them is in their mathematical work necessarily engaging with something that no physical diagram can fully be. The forms are already inside the practice, whether the practitioner is aware of them or not. There is a particular quality to the moment in the Republic where Plato sketches the form of the good. He has been building toward it through the divided line, through the analogy of the sun, through the dense and careful argument of several books, and when he arrives at it, he does not define it. He stops short. Socrates in the dialogue says explicitly that he cannot say what the good itself is, only what it seems like, only what it resembles. The sun, he says, is to the visible realm what the good is to the intelligible realm. As the sun provides not only the light by which visible things are seen, but the energy by which they grow and exist, so the form of the good provides not only the intelligibility by which forms are known, but the being by virtue of which they are. The good is beyond being, Socrates says, beyond it in dignity and power, which is either the most extreme claim in the entire dialogue, or the most honest admission of its limit. The source of all knowledge and all being is itself beyond what knowledge, in its ordinary application, can reach. Plato does not seem distressed by this. The form of the good remains in the architecture of his metaphysics, the unhypothetical first principle that dialectics seeks, the point at which the regress of question and assumption stops, not because an answer has been provided, but because something foundational has been encountered that does not itself require explanation in terms of something prior. Whether this encounter is a genuine philosophical achievement or an elegant gesture toward the unthinkable is a question the tradition has never fully settled. Philosophers who find Plato's mystical register satisfying read it one way. Philosophers who find it evasive read it another. The form of the good sits at the apex of the divided line, illuminating everything below it, not quite reachable in the way that everything below it is reachable. And the best that can be said is that serious engagement with the lower levels of the line will bring a mind into greater proximity with it than disengagement will. Outside the academy, late in the day, the light has moved. The olive trees are casting longer shadows across the ground near the grove where the first students came years ago. The air has that specific cooling quality of a Mediterranean late afternoon, the heat of the day not gone but withdrawing, pulling slightly back from surfaces that have been warm for hours. The questions asked in the room are still in the room, not resolved, not abandoned, but resting in the particular way that genuine philosophical questions rest when they have been given honest attention, the urgency gone out of them, the substance remaining, the difficulty acknowledged and set gently down, somewhere in the gap between the face and the beauty the face carries, between the drawn circle and the perfect circle, the geometer means, between the particular just act and the structural principle that makes it just, somewhere in that gap, which is real and which is not nothing. The forms stand as Plato imagined them, eternal, unchanging, the stable objects of a knowledge that does not bend to time. The problem of how the eternal touches the temporal has not been resolved this afternoon. The particular beautiful face and the form of beauty it participates in remain, in the precise philosophical sense, a mystery, a genuine puzzle about how something non-physical and outside time can stand in a causal or constitutive relationship with something that is physical and entirely within time. Plato has tried the word participation. He has tried imitation. He has tried presence. None of them quite closes the distance. The distance remains as real as the gap between the two sticks held side by side that are almost but not quite equal, in the form of equality that both sticks in their imperfect way are reaching toward. The reaching is the thing. The form is not indifferent to the reaching. It is in a sense what makes the reaching possible, what gives the sticks their orientation, what gives the face its beauty, what gives the just act its justice. The particular things in the visible realm are not separate from the forms and not identical to them. They are in some way that the vocabulary has not yet found the right word for, held by them, sustained in their beauty or their justice or their equality by a relationship that runs from the temporal into the eternal and back again, quietly, without announcement, in every beautiful face that anyone has ever looked at and recognized. The afternoon holds this question, the way an old grove holds the long memory of its trees, without urgency, without destination, in the unhurried warmth of something that has been true for a long time and will remain so, and does not require anything in particular from the mind that rests inside it. In the dry light of an Athenian morning, Socrates crouches beside a boy in the dirt and draws a square. The boy is a slave. He has no formal education, no training in geometry, no reason to know what the lines mean. Socrates draws the first square and asks how large it is. The boy looks, estimates, answers. Socrates draws again, extends the lines, shifts the proportions, and asks again. The boy answers again, more slowly this time, and is wrong. He knows he is wrong. Something in his face does not collapse at the wrongness, but turns toward it, as though wrongness were a direction rather than a verdict. Socrates asks another question, then another. No answers given, only questions offered, quietly, one after the other, in the dusty courtyard of a man named Mano, who stands nearby, watching something happen that he cannot quite name. What is happening, Plato will later argue, is not instruction. It is not the transfer of information from a mind that has it to a mind that lacks it. What is happening is something older and stranger than instruction. The boy is finding his way back to something he already carries. The argument begins, as many of Plato's best arguments do, with a puzzle that stops the thinking rather than starts it. Meno asks the question first. He is a young Thessalian nobleman, confident and accustomed to being agreed with, and he presents what he imagines is a clever trap. If you already know what you are looking for, you have no need to search for it, and if you do not know what you are looking for, you would not recognize it even if you found it. Either way, the search is useless. Either way, inquiry is an illusion. Meno folds his arms and waits. Socrates does not dismiss the puzzle. It is a genuine puzzle. He takes it seriously in the way he takes all genuine difficulties seriously, not by immediately dissolving it, but by sitting inside it long enough to find the shape of what it is actually asking. The problem he eventually offers only arises if learning is acquisition. If learning is recovery, the trap does not close. If the soul already knows, and the work of thinking is the work of remembering what it has always held, then the search is neither futile nor unnecessary. It is simply the long way home. This is what Plato calls anamnes. The word means unforgetting. It means the slow surfacing of what was never truly lost, only submerged beneath the noise of ordinary life, beneath appetite and ambition, and the daily press of visible things. It means that when the boy in the courtyard arrives at the correct answer to Socrates' geometric question, what crosses his face is less the bright shock of discovery than something quieter, something closer to recognition. The way a landscape glimpsed in a dream becomes, on waking, briefly familiar, known already, already held, Mendo watches the boy and concedes that something has happened. He cannot fully account for it. Socrates is careful not to claim too much, not to say this proves the soul's immortality, not to say it settles the question of what knowledge is and where it lives. He says only that the best account he can give, the account he finds most defensible and most worth living with, is that the soul has been here before, that before it arrived in the body, before it began its particular human life with its particular human forgetting, it moved among the forms directly. It knew beauty as beauty, not as the beauty of this face or that flower. It knew equality as equality, not as two sticks that happen to be the same length. It carried all of this, and then it came here, and it forgot. And the work of philosophy, the slow, patient question-by-question work of Socratic inquiry, is the work of recovering what the forgetting covered over. There is something in this idea that resists the usual categories of philosophical argument. It is not a proof in any strict sense. It is more like a proposal, offered with the care one brings to something that cannot be verified, but also cannot be set aside without leaving too much unexplained. Why do the untrained have mathematical intuitions? Why does a correct proof feel, to the mind that follows it, not like the arrival of something new, but like the confirmation of something already suspected? Why does genuine learning feel so often like remembering? Plato does not say these feelings are evidence in the technical sense. He says they are worth thinking about. He says they point somewhere, and then he draws another line in the dirt, and the inquiry continues. Socrates has a way of asking questions that does not feel like interrogation. This is part of what made him dangerous to the people who found him dangerous. A man who extracts confessions through force is recognizable. A man who sits in a courtyard and asks gentle questions until the person answering finds that they know more than they thought they knew, or less, is harder to categorize and harder to refute. The slave boy, when he arrives at the correct answer, has not been told. He has been asked. The distinction is everything to Plato. Telling creates dependence. Asking creates philosophers. There is a small garden in the Meno, not described but implied. The warmth of the morning, the courtyard's enclosure, the particular quality of stillness that attaches itself to geometry when it is being done slowly and without pressure. Meno stands to the side. The boy crouches. Socrates draws. And somewhere in the middle of the demonstration, the texture of the exchange shifts from conversation to something else, something more like a person finding their footing on a path they have been on before without knowing it. The boy is not becoming clever. He is becoming, by inches, more himself. Later, in a very different setting, on the last day of his life, Socrates returns to the same idea from a different angle. The dialogue Plato writes about that day is called the Phaedo, and its setting is a small room in Athens where friends have gathered to spend the final hours with the man they are about to lose. There is grief in the room. Phaedo, who tells the story later, describes people weeping and being told by Socrates, with mild exasperation, that this is exactly the kind of response to death that philosophy exists to examine and ideally to cure. Death, he insists, is not the worst thing. Philosophy is the practice of learning to think clearly about what death is and is not, and what it is not, he believes, is final. Plato does not let the grief dominate. He keeps the scene philosophical, which is the greatest form of respect he can pay to the man he is writing about. The arguments are taken seriously. The interlocutors push back. Socrates meets the pushback honestly. But woven through the formal argumentation is the image of a man who has spent a long life oriented towards something that his body has always been too dense, too loud, too demanding to let him see clearly, and who now, with the hemlock waiting and the afternoon light coming through the window at its particular angle, believes that what awaits him is not nothing but a kind of clarity he has been approaching all his life. The argument Plato gives him here is called the argument from recollection, and it has a precision that the Meno's demonstration lacks. It begins not with a slave boy and a geometric diagram, but with a thought that anyone who has ever looked at two sticks will have had without noticing, that the sticks are roughly equal, but not quite, not perfectly, and yet they are recognized as approximately equal, which means the mind is comparing them to a standard, not the standard of other sticks, the standard of equality itself, perfect equality, which no two physical things have ever achieved, and none ever will, because physical things are always approximately this and approximately that, always falling a little short, always subject to the measurement that finds them wanting. The mind knows what falling short means only because it knows, somewhere, what not falling short would look like. And that knowledge, Plato argues through Socrates, was not acquired here. It was not learned through the senses, because the senses have never delivered perfect equality to anyone. It was brought here. It was already held. This is the argument from recollection in its most compressed form, and it moves with a quiet authority that the best of Plato's arguments have. Not overwhelming, not forcing assent, but making it genuinely difficult to say exactly where the error is. The interlocutors in the Phaedo try. Simonias and Cebes press hard on several points, and Socrates answers them, and they press again, and the afternoon continues. The argument is not airtight. Plato knows it is not airtight. There are places where the conclusions do not quite follow from the premises, places where an alternative explanation might work just as well. But the argument is honest about its limits, and the limits are interesting. They point toward the same region of the question from slightly different directions. What the Phaedo adds to the Meno is not just a more rigorous argument, but a fuller picture of what the soul is that is doing the recollecting. In the Meno, the soul is treated somewhat abstractly, a repository of prenatal knowledge that inquiry can recover. In the Phaedo, and more extensively in the Republic, the soul is given texture and structure. It is not a single unified thing, but something more like a household, containing parts that want different things and pull in different directions, and whose health consists in the right ordering of those parts. Plato divides the soul into three. There is the part that reasons, that seeks truth and proportionality and the long view of things. There is the part he calls spirited, the seat of honor, ambition, indignation, the part that responds to perceived slights and rallies to the defense of what it loves. And there is the part given over to appetite, to hunger and desire and the pleasures that the body generates and demands. All three are real. All three have their proper functions. The mistake is not to have appetites, but to let them govern. The mistake is not to feel indignation, but to let it substitute for reasoning. The soul in which the rational part is listened to, in which the spirited part allies itself with reason rather than appetite, in which appetite is given what it genuinely needs rather than everything it wants. That soul is in Plato's vocabulary just, and that justice is not a political achievement or a legal status. It is a structural condition, a harmony between parts that allows the whole to function as it was built to function. The connection between this ordered soul and the epistemological assent is not incidental. Plato is careful about it. A person wholly governed by appetite is not well positioned to follow a geometric argument to its conclusion, not because they lack the raw cognitive capacity, but because their attention is elsewhere. Their patience is structured around different rewards. Their orientation, the direction in which the whole of them faces, is pointed toward the wrong things. Genuine knowledge, in Plato's account, is not only an intellectual achievement, it is a moral one. The philosopher who arrives at noesis, at the direct apprehension of the forms, has not only thought more carefully than others, they have lived differently. They have cultivated the ordering of the soul that makes that kind of attention possible. Epistemology and ethics are not two subjects in Plato. They are one subject described from two angles. This is why the slave boy demonstration in the Meno is incomplete as a model of philosophical education. The boy can be guided to a correct answer about a square, but arriving at the form of justice, or the form of beauty, or the form of the good itself, that requires not just correct questioning, but a person prepared by the whole shape of their life to receive what the questioning is capable of, uncovering. The soul must already be, in some sense, in the right condition. The rational part must already be accustomed to leading. The appetites must already be in their proper place. Without that ordering, the capacity for analysis remains latent, perpetually interrupted, repeatedly dragged back by the noise of whatever is loudest in the person's inner life. There is something in this that is demanding without being harsh. Plato is not saying that only the already virtuous can learn. He is saying that learning and virtue grow together, that they are aspects of the same movement, that the person who genuinely pursues philosophical inquiry will find themselves, gradually and without quite intending to, becoming more ordered, more patient, more capable of sitting with a question longer than appetite would suggest is worthwhile. The inquiry reshapes the soul that undertakes it. The soul's reshaping makes the inquiry possible. The relationship is not linear but spiral, returning to the same places at different altitudes, finding them changed because the person finding them has changed. Diotima, in the Symposium, describes something very like this, though she describes it through a different vocabulary. Plato gives her the most important speech in the dialogue, which means he gives her the most important speech about love he ever wrote. Diotima is not present. Socrates is at a drinking party, recounting what she once taught him in conversation, her words arriving at 2 removes his memory of her voice, rendered into his speech, set down much later by Plato's hand. There is something fitting about this indirection. Diotima speaks about things that are by nature at a distance from where we stand. It seems right that she herself arrives from a distance. She begins with what everyone already knows about love, that it is a kind of longing, a wanting that reaches towards something beautiful or good. She then asks what love is that does this wanting. Not a god, she says. A god lacks nothing and therefore needs nothing. Love is constituted by need, by the ache of the gap between what is and what is longed for. Love is therefore a daimon, an intermediary, something between human and divine, something that moves between the world of ordinary experience and the world of what is permanently and perfectly real. The soul in love, she tells him, is not diminished by its lack. It is oriented by it. The lack is the direction. The aching want is the vector along which the whole self moves. If it moves truly and follows the want all the way down, rather than stopping at the first thing that seems to satisfy it. A beautiful body is where the ascent begins, not where it ends. What draws the attention toward a single beautiful body is the beauty that is present there, and beauty is not the body. Beauty is what makes the body beautiful, and what makes one beautiful body beautiful also makes another beautiful. The person who is genuinely following their love of beauty rather than their love of this particular beautiful arrangement of matter begins to see this. The attachment loosens slightly, not in the direction of coldness, but in the direction of a wider love. The widening continues. From beautiful bodies to beautiful souls, the people whose inner life carries a quality that the outer life of a face or a form can only approximate. From beautiful souls to beautiful practices, the institutions, rituals, crafts, and disciplines that give form to human aspiration. From beautiful practices to beautiful knowledge, the abstract structures that underlie the particular instances, mathematics and music, and the ordered account of natural things. And then finally, from beautiful knowledge to beauty itself. Diotima describes the arrival at beauty itself with a care that does not make it sound like a reward. It does not sound like the end of wanting. It sounds more like the moment when the wanting finally knows what it has been wanting. The particular faces and bodies and institutions and theorems that beauty has been wearing like garments are not left behind in contempt. They are understood for the first time. The philosopher who has arrived at the form of beauty does not find the particular beautiful things less beautiful. They find them finally and fully beautiful, their beauty no longer puzzling or temporary seeming, but grounded in something that does not change and cannot diminish. The face that was beautiful is still beautiful, but now its beauty has a source that the philosopher can see. Eros, in Diotima's account, is not irrational. It is, if properly followed, the most rational force in human experience, the force that, given free rein and clear direction, leads the soul all the way from the sensory to the eternal. The philosopher is not someone who has abandoned erotic longing. The philosopher is someone who has not abandoned it, who has followed it through all its transformations, who has allowed it to widen until it is large enough to hold the form itself. The love of wisdom is not a cold substitute for the love of beautiful things. It is the same love carried forward, let run its full length. There is something in this that rests differently on the mind than most philosophical arguments do. Most arguments make claims that can be agreed or disagreed with. Diotima's account is less a claim than a description of a movement, the movement the soul makes when it follows its own deepest orientation without stopping prematurely. One can ask whether it is true, but Plato seems to think that asking whether it is true is slightly beside the point. The more useful question is whether it is recognizable, whether there is something in the experience of genuine longing, the way it reaches beyond its apparent object, the way the satisfaction of one desire opens rather than closes the wanting, that corresponds to what Diotima is pointing at, whether the description rings, not with the ringing of a proof, but with the ringing of something described accurately from the inside. The soul that follows this movement, the soul that does not stop at the first beautiful thing, but allows the love to carry it further and further toward what the beautiful things all share, is the soul that arrives, finally at recollection. Not the recollection of a geometric fact, as the slave boy in the Meno demonstrates, the recollection of what beauty is, what justice is, what truth is, the recollection of the forms themselves, which the soul carried before it came here and has been finding its way back to ever since. Anamnesis and eros are, in Plato's account, aspects of the same thing. The unforgetting and the longing are the same direction taken from different starting points. The soul that forgets but can remember, and the soul that lacks but is constituted by its lack and reaches toward what it lacks, these are descriptions of the same soul, the human soul as Plato understands it, already oriented toward what is real, always partially occluded by the conditions of embodied life, capable of recovering through the slow discipline of inquiry and love what its immersion in the particular has covered over. This is a vision that does not lend itself to summary without losing something. Summary compresses the movement into a set of positions, but the movement is the point. The slave boy in the courtyard does not arrive at a theorem. He arrives by degrees at the experience of following a line of reasoning to a conclusion that he recognizes as true. The philosopher in the symposium does not arrive at a doctrine. She arrives by degrees at the experience of a love that has followed itself all the way through its transformations, without stopping, and has found at the end of following something it cannot fully name, but cannot fail to recognize. The soul in the Phaedo does not receive a proof. It receives by degrees the deepening conviction that what it has always been reaching toward is real, that the forms are not inventions to comfort the philosophical mind, but the stable structure of what is, that the recognition it experiences when it grasps a genuine truth is recognition in the fullest sense, return, recovery, the familiar face of something it has known for longer than it can remember. Plato knows and shows that these arguments do not compel assent in the way that a valid deduction from true premises compels assent. The Phaedo's interlocutors know this too, and they say so, and Socrates agrees with them. The best philosophical argument about the soul and its origins and its relationship to the forms is in the end not a proof but a map of the best account currently available, offered honestly, held with appropriate tentativeness, revised whenever a genuine difficulty demands revision. The slave boy's geometry can be verified by redrawing the diagram. The soul's prenatal knowledge of the forms cannot be verified in any analogous way. It can only be argued for and argued against and argued for again with honesty and patience and the particular kind of love for the truth that does not need to win in order to continue. There is a kind of philosophical rest that this ongoing quality eventually produces. Not the rest of a problem solved, not the rest of a question closed, the rest that comes from having followed a question honestly for long enough that the urgency drains away, and what remains is the question itself, still open, still genuine, but no longer frightening. Plato spent approximately 40 years of his life following these questions. He revised his positions, acknowledged the difficulties his own arguments generated, wrote interlocutors who pushed back hard, and received honest responses. He did not arrive at a system fully sealed against objection.